meet with anybody else to discuss ideas and suggestions that they have.
Thank you. That ends general questions. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Much, Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
With permission, Presiding Officer, it might be useful for members to give a brief update on the position regarding the severe weather disruption facing Scotland at the present moment. As members will know, we've had gusts of over 100 miles an hour in many areas of Scotland. The Scottish Government Resilience Operation has been in operation all day. The Transport Minister is in the Transport Scotland control room and will be there until the emergency passes. I can confirm to the Chamber there has been one reported fatality, weather-related in Scotland. There have been a number of injuries. Thankfully, none of them as yet reported as serious. There has been significant disruption to road, rail and ferry infrastructure. Our utility companies have reported 100,000 customers have been offline, but 15,000 reconnections have already been made and they will continue through the day. Presiding Officer, in light of the tragedy at the Clutha Bar, we have had very good reason, all of us, to pay tribute to the outstanding work of our emergency services. I can reassure the Chamber that that work is on again today as we respond to the ongoing emergency of the weather conditions.
Joanne Lamont.
Can I thank the First Minister very much for that update. Obviously, our thoughts are with those families who have now been sorely affected by this bad weather, but also with all those brave people, emergency services and other agencies who are working to get Scotland safe again for people to be able to move about the country. The First Minister put at the heart of his White Paper for Independence childcare. Can the First Minister tell me what the final stage of his plans would cost, how many jobs would be created and what the average salary of those jobs would be if a separate Scotland was going to recoup the cost of the policy? Forgive me, I thought the policy was a serious one. What the average salary of those jobs would be. It's the SNP backbenchers who are laughing. However, perhaps we can get the answer to the question. How many jobs would be created? What the average salary of those jobs would be if a separate Scotland was going to recoup the cost of the policy, as the White Paper says it would, in income tax?
First
well,
Minister.
The policy in terms of the first term of office of an independent Scottish Parliament would cost £700 million a year. In terms of additional jobs in childcare, it would require a doubling of the childcare workforce. That's an increase of 30,000 jobs. Of course, one of the great economic benefits is releasing the availability of more women to move back into the workforce. That estimate is just short of 100,000, assuming we could raise participation rates in the workforce for women in Scotland to the same level as Sweden. The Swedish example was taken for a number of reasons, but there's a lot of credibility in it on the basis that male participation in the workforce in Scotland and Sweden is virtually identical at the present moment. And there seems no other good reason why there should be a 6% differential in female participation in the workforce, except for the fact that Sweden has such extraordinary supported childcare arrangements that provide the opportunity for more equality in the workforce by allowing women not just to care properly for their children, but also to fully participate in the workforce and society.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, whatever that was, it wasn't an answer to the question I asked. And perhaps the First Minister might want to reflect on the fact that modern women are not too impressed by men who promise the earth without any evidence that they are serious about it. And in that evidence, he isn't serious about it. So let me try and help the First Minister. The Scottish Parliament Information Centre estimates the cost of the policy to be at least £1.2 billion a year, and that's without the cost of new buildings and facilities to meet increased demand. Since the First Minister has promised for months that the White Paper would answer all the questions about independence, he must have worked out how many jobs at what average salary would need to be created for the policy to pay for itself. Unfortunately, in 670 pages, there was enough room to explain what time zone we would be in, but not these details. Could the First Minister now give Scottish families, men and women, the details they deserve to know?
First Minister.
Joanne Lamont asked me a
First
question
Minister,
about the number
order.
of jobs created. I pointed out it would require 30,000 extra jobs in the childcare workforce. It would release an estimated almost 100,000 people, mainly women, back into the workforce and available to work. By the end of the first Parliament, if we remember, and that's the question I answered, around 50% of 2-year-olds and all 3- and 4-year-olds would be entitled to 1,140 hours of childcare a year. That would be one of the great benefits of having the freedom of independence. That would require an investment per annum of £600 million a year, in addition to the £100 million in the first year to make the improvements that were specified there. Now, that is an argued transformational change in childcare provision in Scotland. What we've pointed out consistently is that if you look at the benefits in terms of increased taxation revenue from releasing that additional workforce into the community of Scotland, and the range of benefits in terms of employers' national insurance, employees' national insurance, income tax, VAT, and the range of economic expansion, then these revenues will flow into the Scottish Exchequer in an independent Scotland. Under the devolution position that we have now, and the one proposed by Joanne Lamont, they'll go into the back pocket of George Osborne. Yeah. And as we are finding out from the autumn statement today, when it comes to increasing Scottish expenditure, we don't want to look for the Tory Chancellor in London, who looks forward to further years of austerity. And that is why the difference is opening up, by showing that that transformational policy in childcare can be afforded, can be pursued in an independent Scotland, just as it's pursued at the present moment in an independent Sweden.
Joanne Lamont, order.
First of all, the First Minister reread the answer to the question I didn't ask him. He has not yet explained how he would cost the bit beyond the first term. He simply ignored that. He then says it is transformational, but doesn't give us the figures. You need to know the figures for it to be more than simple assertion. Now, I have done some estimates of my own. Let's give the First Minister...
Order.
In order to be of assistance to the First Minister, of course. So let's give the First Minister the maximum benefit of the doubt. There are currently 90,000 women unemployed. Let's imagine they all get jobs because of this policy, even the ones without children. And to give the First Minister the biggest possible tax base to draw from, let's say all of the 35,000 jobs he says will be created in childcare don't go to any of those women, but all go to unemployed men. That's 125,000 people off the dole, saving at the most £370 million in job seekers' allowance. These people need collectively to pay £830 million in income tax for the policy to pay for itself, as the much vaunted...
Order.
I'm only quoting what the white paper says, which is supposed to be the Bible. It's the white paper that says it will, and presumably he will rest on the figures in the white paper. Doesn't that mean, on average, every single one of them would have to earn more than £42,000 a year, almost twice the average wage, for an independent Scotland to recoup the money?
First Minister, order.
The calculation on additional income to government is about a calculation on the increase in output that's generated by that increase in the labour force. That increase in output goes across the economy. It benefits lots and lots of people. If you have more people in employment spending more, it doesn't just mean that they pay more tax. The people who benefit from the economic expansion also contribute more tax. And the calculations... This is why, incidentally, I'd have thought this would be recognised by the Labour Party, since they've deployed this argument time after time in terms of the debates in the Westminster Parliament. Unfortunately, that instruction hasn't drifted its way up to Scotland. It's the benefits of an economic expansion as opposed to the austerity policies we've been suffering from in Westminster over recent years from both Labour and Tory governments. Now, I'm surprised that Joanne Lamont doesn't embrace this expansion, transformational change in childcare. She came to see me some months ago and still can't explain how she would pay for any increase in child provision in Scotland, and not a single positive idea or amendment in the budget to tell us what Labour's plans would be to make any change in the provision of childcare. Joanne Lamont doubts or seems to suggest it would be very difficult to get that expansion of numbers of women back into the workforce in Scotland. Incidentally, thanks to the benefit of John Swinney's initiatives in this matter, that female participation of workers in employment among women in Scotland has increased by 3% over the last year or two in Scotland. Therefore, I don't think it's over-ambitious to suggest that with a transformational offer in childcare, that a 6% increase could be achieved, and that talent and ability which is locked away at the present moment could be used for the benefit of these families and for the wider Scottish economy. Can I say how absolutely delighted I am to get this debate onto the benefits of independence? Let's talk about jobs, let's talk about families, and let's talk about the transformation of childcare in society.
Joanne Lamont.
Now we have the truth of it. This isn't about men and women struggling with childcare. It's about getting on to the benefits of independence. How disgraceful! How disgraceful! It is an opportunity to argue about independence rather than addressing the needs of families right across Scotland. He says it benefits lots and lots of people. I hate to tell you, that's not good enough. His white paper is predicated not on output, but on the money recouped through income tax, and he hasn't been able to show us the figures. If he's telling us his white paper isn't telling us the truth, it will come no surprise to us. It might come as some surprise to the people behind him. If the First Minister doesn't like my figures, and his own figures don't appear to exist, let me give him some that he has got, that he has provided, he has not provided today. According to Scottish Government figures, if 105,000 women joined the workforce, more than the number currently unemployed, the tax revenues would be less than half of the most optimistic estimates of this cost. Last week, the First Minister was Googling his answers, but even Google cannot make these figures work. In order that we don't have to wait for a freedom of information request to get the fag packet this policy was worked out on, crudely to win votes for independence, not to meet families, will the First Minister now publish full costings of his flagship policy, or admit it is a shameless attempt to con the people of Scotland, and we've all seen through it?
First Minister.
Line of questioning. We still don't know if the Labour Party are for or against a transformation in childcare provision in Scotland. I'll be delighted. Well, we don't know, because they haven't laid out their policies. They haven't said how they'll pay for it. We know that the Cuts Commission is detailed, looking at cutting free transport, free personal care, reintroducing tuition fees, but I don't think these options are going to be palatable to people of Scotland. I'll be delighted to lay down the calculations which show how an expansion in economic activity results in a £700 million increase in Scottish revenues. Now, of course, that increase in Scottish revenues would occur just now. But what happens, of course, is all of these revenues go, or the vast majority of them, go to the Westminster Exchequer at the present moment. So is it likely, if just let's imagine for a second, that Labour decided to cut everything else and go for a transformation in childcare, and these additional revenues were generated, do we think that George Osborne would say, that is fantastic, I'll immediately return these additional revenues to Scotland, I shall help Scotland, I think their policy on childcare should be supported? That's not the fate that any of the no parties have for Scotland in the event of a no vote. We know what it is. It's a £4,000 million cut from the existing position in Scottish public finance. And we know also that that is something supported by an all-party, not just the Tories, but the Labour Party as well. So not only do we have the prospect of a transformation in childcare and all that means to family and women equality in Scotland. Not only do we have the policy which can result in a huge increase in jobs and economic output into Scotland, we know what the alternative is, which is no improvements in childcare and a slashing of the Scottish budget following a no vote.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans near future, but if it's helpful, I would make it clear that I will protect the Secretary of State for Scotland at any future meeting from the debating skills of the Deputy First Minister.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, we ask nurses to work long hours in physically and emotionally demanding jobs, and they do it with a huge amount of professionalism and care. But we also need to care for them. In 2006, the Royal College of Nurses reported that 1 in 5 nurses had suffered bullying in work in the previous year. At the time, the RCN said that such treatment was unacceptable and added that we can't expect nurses to put up with this at work. The RCN report out today shows that the number of nurses bullied over the past 12 months has risen from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. Can I ask what steps the Scottish Government are taking to help tackle this problem?
First Minister.
Well, let's make clear that the Scottish Government has a zero-tolerance approach to bullying in the workforce. There was a number of aspects of that survey which would cause concern. The Secretary for Health has already written to health boards around Scotland drawing attention to the survey, and in particular the suggestion that people in some cases were not being properly enumerated for work that they were committed in doing. The Secretary for Health has made it clear to health boards that people must be properly remunerated. And you'll find that the Scottish Government and our partners throughout the health service and public services are hugely responsive to any indications that bullying or indeed other unacceptable practices may be taking place in our public services in Scotland.
Ruth Davidson.
I welcome the words of the First Minister and the sentiments behind them, but the fact remains that nurses themselves say that the problems are getting worse, not better, that 1 in 3 are bullied, and that's the equivalent of nearly 20,000 nurses who faced abuse in the last 12 months in Scotland. We appear to have a system and a culture where bullying against nursing staff is widespread and systemic practice in our hospitals and our health centres. It's clear that we are not rooting out the bullies, we have not changed the management culture by which this is allowed to happen, and that we are not properly supporting those staff who have an already difficult job made much harder by the abuse they experience from their managers or colleagues. Our nurses have consistently been failed, and we have to act now to make it better. Bullying in any form is unacceptable. I want to do something about it. I know that the First Minister will want to do something about it too. So will he meet with me, with the other party leaders and with nursing representatives to draw up an action plan to help right this wrong?
First Minister.
Well, as I've said to Ruth Davidson, that we are sensitive and responsive to any indications that management practices aren't what they should do in the health service. I can arrange a meeting with the other party leaders to take forward that argument. 2 things I would say to Ruth Davidson. She should look at how the nursing workforce planning tools in terms of the future direction of workforce have been welcomed by the RCN. That's going to be a very important aspect in terms of future planning of National Health Service staff. She'll know that we have more qualified nurses, more staff in the health service than we had in 2007. But she should appreciate the welcome by the RCN to that particular initiative. And although the points she makes are very, very important, she should also remember there have been certain guarantees given to our public services in Scotland which have provided a great deal of reassurance. A guarantee, for example, in no compulsory redundancies. And I mention that, of course, because she might be aware that the National Health Service in England have made a total of 8,702 compulsory redundancies since July 2011. So while I accept her point that we must be vigilant, and we'll do it on a cross-party basis, in terms of eradicating any unacceptable management practices in the National Health Service, I hope she will be generous enough to concede that both in terms of workforce planning, hugely welcomed by the RCN, and in terms of the no compulsory redundancy policy, there are aspects of the public service workforce in Scotland which are incomparably better than to what is happening elsewhere in these islands.
Constituency question, John Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know the First Minister is aware of the dreadful weather conditions affecting many parts of Scotland, including the Scottish borders today. Many schools in the borders have had to close this morning due to the loss of power. Can the First Minister assure me that the Government will be doing everything possible to ensure that local council is supported, given all the support that it needs to get local schools reconnected to their power supplies as quickly as possible?
First Minister.
Yes, case to member, I tried to give a brief update earlier on. The number of school closures is 195, of which 7 have been in the Scottish borders. That was at 10:45, but it is, as he will appreciate, an evolving situation. The Minister of Transport and the Resilience room are in full operation, and you'll find that our public services are working very hard indeed, firstly to inform the public of the likely consequences of the disruption, including school closures, but also the disruption to travel and to electricity supply, and also, of course, to restore supplies as quickly as possible. And I'll arrange for information to be lodged in the Parliament so that any member can see the situation in their area around Scotland.
Lewis MacDonald.
First Minister aware that funding of NHS Grampian falls short of what it should be under the Government's own funding formula by £35 million a year. Does he agree with the Chief Executive of NHS Grampian, who told the Health Board this week that trying to run health services without proper funding was like running a race against Usain Bolt and having to give him 4 yards of a start? And will he help Grampian to catch up by setting a firm timetable for full implementation of the Government's own funding formula in the very near future?
First Minister.
Yes, well, the member will know that we've taken a policy to bring the boards which are under the parity towards parity, but to try and do so in a way which doesn't cut services elsewhere. You should also be aware that this week I visited the new health village in Grampian, the first of the hub initiatives, which will have 500 to 600 staff working in a combined service delivery. And from the 10th of December, we'll be seeing many, many patients. I think you should welcome that initiative. It's the first of its kind in Scotland, one of many which are being rolled out. And he should also be aware that I monitor, as he'll understand as a local Member of Parliament, very closely the statistics on waiting times in the emergency centre in Grampian. I can tell him that spectacular new investment has been one of the reasons, along with the commitment of our National Health Service staff, for a very, very good performance in terms of meeting the targets on throughput of patients. An indication that, combined with the new facilities coming into place and the commitment of our staff, we can still make substantial improvements in our health service, which I'm sure all members will welcome.
Question number 3, Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what recent conversations the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government regarding the Barnett formula.
First Minister.
Well, I've written to the Prime Minister seeking clarity on the proposed £4 billion Westminster plan for a budget cut in Scotland in the event of a no vote. Now, while the Prime Minister has not yet provided any answers over the future of the Barnett formula, we do know these Westminster calls for spending to be cut in Scotland by as much as £4 billion would be equivalent to an extra £1,600 for every income taxpayer in Scotland. £1,600 for every income taxpayer in Scotland. And we also know, of course, that in every one of the last 32 years, Scotland has contributed more in tax per head than the UK, and in the 5 years to 2011-12, the relative surplus was £12.6 billion. It does seem extraordinary, in the face of these figures on income, that Westminster parties, together in an all-party committee, are actually proposing to follow the provisions of the Holtham Commission and suggesting a £4 billion cut in Scottish expenditure. And I think it's very important that the Prime Minister answers that letter and reveals the intentions of this government if there were a no vote in Scotland next year.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. As well as a £4 billion cut, we also know from the Chancellor's autumn statement that Westminster have their sights set on Scotland's pensioners, Duncan, with plans to raise the retirement age. Does the First Minister agree with me that under these Westminster plans, people in Scotland will enjoy fewer years of retirement than pensioners than almost any other part of Europe? And does he also agree that this is yet another reason for Scotland to vote yes in next year's referendum?
First Minister.
Yes, well, I heard when Bruce Crawford was making these excellent points, some indication of disquiet from the Labour Party backbenches. There should be disquiet. An all-party committee has put forward a proposal that the Holtham proposals should be followed with regard to Scottish spending in the event of a no vote. We know what the Holtham proposals are. In an article described as Scotland, this is the head of the article, Scotland is taking more than its share of funds by members of the Holtham Commission in the Financial Times. They estimated that would cut Scotland's spending by £4 billion a year. Now, I've already indicated what that would mean in terms of an income tax rise for every taxpayer in Scotland, but perhaps this chamber would like to reflect that the dramatic cuts we've seen over this period of austerity amount to something in real terms in the Scottish budget of just over £3 billion a year. So what their colleagues in Westminster have in mind for Scotland is a cut following a no vote, even greater than the austerity we've seen from Labour and Tory governments over the last few years. There's so quiet in the Labour benches, there will be more disquiet around Scotland as these facts percolate through into the debate.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Can the First Minister tell us why the lead debating point in favour of independence of him and his party colleagues this week has become the report of an obscure Westminster committee? Is it because his substantive economic and financial arguments in favour of independence have fallen apart within days, so that his project wish of last week has become Project Scare today?
First Minister. Order.
The lead debating point for the case for independence is to explain how, in the transformation of childcare provision in this country, independence means jobs and new prosperity for Scotland. But can I say to Malcolm Chisholm why I take this seriously? Because I met George Osborne when he was Shadow Chancellor to ask him what his intentions were with regard to the Barnett formula. And he told me it was his intention to scrap the Barnett formula. He told me that. Alistair Carmichael says the Barnett formula will be there until this period of austerity is over. George Osborne has just told us that the economy has now stabilised. That's why it's legitimate to point out the consequences of a no vote in Scotland. Now, of course, the argument is that we say we want to have access to Scottish revenue, because, yes, we received 9.3% of spending in the last count, but we generated 9.9% of the revenue of this country. What the No campaign and his colleagues in Westminster want to do, and I'll make available to Spice a range of quotations from his colleagues and others heading in that direction, is to cut Scottish spending but keep Westminster access to Scottish revenue. And as that argument comes through, with the transformation in society that's possible for having access to Scottish resources, then this argument will follow the yes vote next year.
Question number 4, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister which powers over land ownership could be devolved to the Scottish Parliament to strengthen Scottish land reform.
First Minister.
Well, the land reform agenda is part of building a more equal society. We are committed to taking forward proposals on land reform that contribute to the success of Scotland for future generations. Indeed, earlier this year, I announced a target to have 1 million acres of land in community ownership by 2020. Now, I'm not going to preempt the findings of the Land Reform Review Group or charged with producing proposals on land reform. But it's fair to say, of course, that decisions about ownership, leasing and development of land are very much tied to policies on taxation.
Rob Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer with regard to taxation, because would he agree with me that Westminster's Scottish Affairs Committee, who are inquiring into land reform, which met in Inverness last week, must focus on ways to end the UK tax system's lenient treatment of landowners who use allowances for inheritance and capital gains tax, the vesting of companies whose beneficial owners are concealed, the registration of such entities in offshore tax havens, such as Grand Cayman, and the offsetting of estate management losses against landowners' other non-landed business interests, and that each one of these reserved powers hinders Scotland's effective approach through this Parliament to land reform.
First Minister.
Which is why we've set out in the White Paper we'd want a simple, transparent tax system after independence designed to minimise the opportunities for tax avoidance. As it's in its constituency, The member will also be aware of other reserve powers that are important. You'll remember the attempted land grab by the Ministry of Defence of Cape Wrath, contrary to the wishes of the local community. And I can assure him, with the powers of independence, including powers over all public land owned by the Crown Estate and the Ministry of Defence, that such a situation would not be allowed to happen. And I hope and believe that people in this chamber will celebrate the fact that in that target for 1 million acres of land and community ownership, not making up a huge contribution to the target in numbers, but nonetheless hugely important for communities and symbolically, we now or shortly will have a situation where the Mullagalloway lighthouse in the south-west tip of Scotland is in community ownership, and Cape Wrath in the far north of Scotland, in the mainland Scotland, will soon be in community ownership. And I think most people in Scotland will think that symbolically is hugely important to these communities, and points the way forward to the benefits of having 1 million acres in community ownership by 2020.
Question 5, Sarah Boyack.
To the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, Coping with the Cuts, Local Government and Poorer Communities.
First Minister.
Well, at a time when the Scottish Government's budget has been cut by over 10% in real terms for the 2010-16 period as a result of the austerity agendas of the Westminster parties, the Scottish Government have worked very closely with our local government partners to protect communities from the worst of these cuts. As the Joseph Rowntree report makes clear, Scottish local authorities have fared substantially better than their English counterparts. Over the 4-year period 2012 to 16, local government's revenue funding and capital share were maintained on a like-for-like basis, with extra monies available for new duties. While the Joseph Rowntree report recognised the protection we have provided to council budgets in Scotland, it is disappointing the analysis fails to recognise that the level of funding for individual local authorities in Scotland is determined by the needs-based funding formula agreed by COSLA, which is largely driven by population and, of course, importantly, by pupil numbers.
Sarah Boyack.
First Minister, we can agree that local government is one of the foremost casualties of austerity in the UK, but given that local government has borne the brunt of the Scottish Government's cut at a time when costs for providing those services have risen by 10% since 2007, with big social care and welfare challenges yet to come, does the First Minister accept that, given the loss of £1 billion from Scottish Government spending on anti-poverty programmes, it's vital that next week's local government finance statement is underpinned by principles of fairness and social justice if the most vulnerable in our communities are not to be subjected not just to austerity, but to austerity plus?
First Minister.
Well, yes, which would seem a good reason for Scotland never again being subjected to the government like they have the present one for Westminster. But can I just take issue with Sarah Boyack in terms of how she describes the situation? I mean, I've got the figures here in terms of local government spending in DEL as part of the overall Scottish bloc. That has increased in 2006-2007 from 34.7% to 36.4%. On a like-for-like basis. It's simply not true. On the contrary, as indeed the Joseph Rowntree report indicates, the Scottish local authorities have not just fared better than their English counterparts, but they have a rising part on a like-for-like basis of Scottish spending. So it's simply incorrect for Sarah Boyack to try and assert that the local government has borne the burden of cuts. On the contrary, the impact of the percentage of local government spending as part of the total budget that we have has risen from the years 2006-2007. I don't accept the argument that this government isn't acting to mitigate the impact of austerity and poverty. I mean, for example, over the period from 2013-14 to 15-16, to mitigate the impact of Westminster's welfare reform, there's going to be spending of £244 million. But, you know, maybe Sarah Boyack and I at some stage will come to an agreement that instead of having to take action to mitigate the worst of Westminster spending cuts, perhaps we should cut charge of the resources of this nation and be in a position where we can plan out a new future for the country.
Briefly, Linda Fabiani.
Presiding officer, that the First Minister explained earlier to the opposition benches the reality of the £4 billion cut that's coming down the line from Westminster. I wonder if the First Minister would take this opportunity to explain to the opposition the potential impact of that on this Parliament's efforts to tackle poverty.
First Minister.
Well, we've seen extraordinary results already from the austerity programme. A continuation of that austerity is going to cause a great deal of misery across Scottish society, both in terms of our action in the Scottish Welfare Fund, in supporting the charities and advice services, in terms of those suffering from benefit cuts, and also in the council tax reduction scheme, in partnership with our local authorities to protect the people on council tax benefit from the impact of austerity, and indeed the commitment to mitigate the bedroom tax this year and next year. The Scottish Government has done everything within its powers to try and take the edge off these harsh policies from Westminster. But of course, the result of these policies from Westminster will be to make Scotland a more unequal society, and that is exactly why we have to take charge of the resources and spending of this country to move policy in an opposite and much better direction.
That ends First Minister's questions. We now move to members' business. I'll allow a short pause for members who are leaving the chamber and visitors to the gallery to clear before we go on.